He was working alone, miles deep in a forest, when he started finding small, hand-carved gifts. The problem was they were being left for him inside his locked truck. Welcome to Echoed Chronicles. For this tale, we travel to the quiet, lonely foothills of the Oregon Cascades. The job was a good one, the kind of contract that made the lean months worthwhile. It was a preliminary geological survey for a proposed wind farm covering a vast and lonely expanse of land in the foothills of the Oregon Cascades. For 3 weeks, my world would be reduced to a grid of coordinates, the whine of my ATV, and the quiet companionship of Douglas firs. I was a geological surveyor, a job that suited my temperament. I liked the precision, the solitude, the feeling of imposing a perfect mathematical order onto a messy, organic landscape. My name is Simon Kendrick. At 32, I had found a career that paid me to be alone in beautiful places, and I considered that a rare kind of success. The company rented a cabin for me. It was about 5 miles down a gravel road off State Highway 22, a small, functional box of cedar and glass tucked into a fold of the hills. It had a porch, a stone fireplace, and spotty cell service. Perfect. The first 2 days were a blur of methodical work. I'd wake before dawn, drink coffee black and bitter while watching the mist burn off the hills, and then head out. I spent the days setting up my total station, a tripod-mounted beast of lenses and lasers, and hiking for miles to hammer in survey markers, stout wooden stakes topped with fluorescent orange caps. It was tedious, physical work that emptied my mind and left me pleasantly exhausted by nightfall. The first oddity occurred on the 3rd day. I was working my way up a long, sloping ridge, connecting the dots of the survey grid I'd laid out the previous afternoon. I found the first marker, GS-14, exactly where I'd left it. The second, GS-15, was also correct. But when I got to the location for GS-16, the stake was gone. I checked my GPS unit. I was in the right spot, a small clearing of salal bushes and mossy rock. I scanned the area, annoyed. Animals, usually deer, would occasionally knock over a stake. It was part of the job. I found it lying on its side about 10 feet away, nestled at the base of a hemlock tree. The ground around the original hole was undisturbed, no tracks or scuff marks. It was strange. It didn't look knocked over. It looked placed. I chalked it up to a fluke, replanted the stake with a few firm blows from my mallet, took my readings, and moved on. That evening, back at the cabin, I felt the first faint prickle of unease. It was nothing tangible, just a feeling. The silence seemed deeper, the shadows thrown by the setting sun longer and more distorted. I shrugged it off as a side effect of isolation. It happens. You spend enough time with only the wind for conversation and your brain starts to play tricks on you. I made dinner, read a chapter of a paperback history of the Oregon Trail, and went to bed. The next day, 2 more markers had been moved. Not just knocked over, but deliberately pulled from the earth and laid carefully on the ground a few yards away. This time, GS-21 and GS-22. They were laid parallel to each other, pointing due west. There was a neatness to it that was far more unsettling than simple vandalism. This wasn't an animal. An animal is random, chaotic. This was tidy. This was intentional. I felt a surge of irritation. Local kids, I figured, or maybe someone opposed to the wind farm project. It was a common enough occurrence. I replanted the stakes, made a note in my logbook, and tried to push the incident from my mind. But the feeling of being watched, a classic trope of campfire stories, began to take root in a very real and unwelcome way. As I worked, I found myself stopping to listen, scanning the dense, silent treeline. I saw nothing but swaying branches and the occasional flicker of a Steller's jay. When I got back to my truck that evening, a white Ford F 150 rented from the airport in Portland. I saw something on the dashboard. It was a small, crudely carved bird, whittled from a piece of pale, soft wood, maybe pine. It was no bigger than my thumb, its features simple but distinct. I froze, my hand on the door handle. I knew with absolute certainty that I had locked the truck. I always did. It was an automatic, unthinking habit. I circled the vehicle, checking each door. All locked tight. I peered through the windows. No sign of forced entry, no shattered glass, no scratches around the locks. My heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked the fob, the locks chirped open, and I reached in and picked up the little wooden bird. It was smooth, almost warm to the touch. There was no note, no explanation, just a small, silent token left inside my locked truck in the middle of nowhere. I searched the cab. My GPS, my field laptop, my wallet tucked in the center console, all untouched. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was out of place except for this tiny, impossible object. That night, the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every skittering sound on the roof was amplified. I sat at the small kitchen table, the wooden bird in front of me, trying to reason it out. A prank? But the locked door. Was it possible I had forgotten to lock it? Just this once? It seemed unlikely. I was a creature of habit, and my routines were the bedrock of my life. Could someone have a Slim Jim? A spare key? The thought sent a chill down my spine. The rental company? A previous renter? I called my supervisor the next morning. Her name was Brenda. She was a no-nonsense geologist in her 50s who had seen it all. "The markers are being moved?" she asked, her voice tinny over the weak connection. "Kids, Simon, or protesters. Happens all the time. Don't let them get to you. Just log the delays and redo the work. The company will eat the cost." "Brenda, that's not all," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone got into my truck yesterday. It was locked. They left something. A little wood carving." There was a pause on the other end. "They didn't take anything?" "No, nothing. Just left this thing on the dash." I could almost hear her sigh. "Look, it's probably just some local trying to spook you. They don't want a few hundred wind turbines spoiling their view. It's a scare tactic. Annoying but harmless. Are you feeling okay out there? You sound stressed." "I'm fine," I lied. "It's just unsettling." "I get it," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't. "Not really. Just be aware of your surroundings. Keep your doors locked. If you're really worried, pick up a cheap trail camera. Set it up on the truck. If someone's messing with it, you'll get their picture." It was practical advice, but it did little to soothe the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Her explanation made sense on the surface, but it didn't account for the quiet, methodical strangeness of it all. This didn't feel like a protest. It felt personal. I took her advice. I drove the 40 minutes into the nearest town, a place called Mill City, and bought a trail camera from the hardware store. It felt like a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim some control. That afternoon, I found another marker moved, GS 34. This time, a small, flat stone had been placed in the hole where the stake should have been. It was another precise, deliberate act that spoke of patience and purpose. I set up the new camera that evening, strapping it to a thick alder tree overlooking a key section of the survey line I planned to work the next day. I angled it perfectly, ensuring it captured the 3 most prominent markers in the area. The tiny red light blinked, confirming it was active. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of hope. The mystery had a face, and soon I would see it. The next morning, I practically jogged to the site, my anxiety mixed with a strange, vindictive excitement. I saw the camera on the tree from a distance and my shoulders sagged with relief. It was still there, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The camera was untouched. The strap was secure, the lens clean, but the small hinge door on its side, the one that covered the memory card slot, was wide open. The SD card was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty slot in the camera. The forest was silent except for the sighing of the wind through the high branches. Whoever did this had watched me set it up. They had waited, let me leave, and then calmly walked up, opened the little plastic door, and pocketed the one thing that could have identified them. They hadn't smashed the camera or stolen it. They had simply removed the evidence, an act of such quiet, confident dominance that it made my blood run cold. This wasn't a protester. This wasn't a teenager. This was something else. Someone patient and clever. Someone who knew this terrain far better than I did. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a confirmed, tactical reality. I was the subject of a study, and my observer was steps ahead of me. I abandoned work for the day. The idea of setting up my tripod, of focusing on the minute measurements of the land while someone could be focusing on me through a pair of binoculars, was unbearable. I packed my gear with fumbling, hurried movements, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the wall of green. Every shadow seemed to harbor a human shape. I unscrewed the useless trail camera from the tree, a plastic monument to my own naivete, and threw it onto the passenger seat of the truck. The 5-mile drive back down the gravel road to the cabin was torturous. I watched the rearview mirror obsessively. Every flicker of movement in the woods along the road, every distant glint of light, became a potential threat. A dark green Subaru was parked in a small turnout a mile from my cabin, a man with a gray beard in the driver's seat. He was just looking at a map, or maybe his phone. It was probably nothing. A hiker, tourist, but in my heightened state, he was a potential accomplice, a lookout. My mind was manufacturing threats everywhere. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly as I had left it. Peaceful, unassuming, but the sense of safety it once offered was gone, replaced by a deep-seated violation. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my senses on high alert. The air was still. The faint scent of old wood and the coffee I'd made that morning hung in the air. I did a slow, methodical sweep. I started in the main room, my eyes tracing the lines of the furniture, the placement of my books, the clutter on the kitchen counter. Everything seemed right. I checked the small bedroom. The bed was unmade, just as I'd left it. My worn paperback was on the nightstand. I went into the bathroom. The cap was on the toothpaste. My towel was hanging on the hook. It was as I was about to leave the bathroom that I saw it. On the small, foggy mirror above the sink, someone had used their finger to draw a single, simple shape in the condensation. A bird. The same shape as the wooden carving, with its upturned wings and pointed tail. My breath hitched. I hadn't used the hot water this morning. There shouldn't have been any condensation. Someone had been in here. They had been in my bathroom. They had stood right where I was standing. The drawing was already starting to fade as the residual moisture evaporated. A ghostly message that was never meant to last. It was a whisper, not a shout. "I can go anywhere," it said. "I can get into your truck. I can get into your house." That was it. I was done. I wasn't going to spend another night in this place. I grabbed my duffel bag and started throwing my clothes into it, my heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm. I stuffed my laptop, my logbook, and the little wooden bird into my backpack. I didn't want to leave any part of myself here. I drove back towards Mill City, not stopping until the gravel road met the pavement of Highway 22. The simple act of driving on asphalt felt like a return to civilization, a small anchor in a sea of escalating dread. I found a nondescript motel on the edge of town called the River's Bend Inn, a U-shaped building with faded blue doors. I paid cash for a room. The room was Spartan and smelled of industrial cleaner, but it had a heavy deadbolt and a chain lock, and for the first time all day I felt like I could breathe. I slid the chain, locked the deadbolt, and wedged a chair under the doorknob, just in case. I sat on the edge of the stiff polyester bedspread and tried to think. Calling Brenda again was pointless. Someone drew a bird on my bathroom mirror. Sounded like a line from a bad horror movie. She would think I was cracking up. The police? What would I tell them? Someone was moving my stakes and leaving me creepy folk art? They'd file a report at best. But they wouldn't send a detective out to the woods to investigate a whittled bird. I was on my own. My isolation felt absolute. I was a stranger here, a temporary fixture in a landscape that had its own rules, its own history, and someone from that history had taken an interest in me. I thought about packing it all in, calling Brenda and telling her I was quitting the job, but a stubborn, angry part of me refused. I wasn't going to be run off by some backwoods weirdo. I had a job to do, but I wasn't going back to that cabin. Tomorrow, I decided I would drive out to the site from the motel. It would add over an hour to my commute each way, but it was a price I was willing to pay for a locked door and the proximity of other people. I had to finish this survey. I had to see this through. The thought was equal parts terrifying and resolute. My observer had shown me their reach. Now, I had to find a way to work under their invisible, all-seeing eye. The next 2 days were a masterclass in controlled paranoia. I commuted from the motel, the sterile room a psychological airlock between the real world and the one I entered every time I turned onto that gravel road. I worked with my head on a swivel. I'd set up my total station and take my readings in a fraction of the usual time, my efficiency born of pure fear. I packed a lunch and ate it in the locked cab of my truck, my eyes scanning the impassive trees. The strange activity stopped. No markers were moved. No new carvings appeared. But the silence was worse. The absence of action felt like a deliberate choice, a demonstration of restraint. It meant my observer was still there, watching, and had decided to simply let me sweat. The game had changed from active harassment to a war of attrition on my nerves. I felt like a mouse in a maze, and the researcher had paused the experiment to see how I'd behave without stimulus. On the third day, my last planned day of fieldwork in that sector, I arrived to find something new. It was not on my truck, nor in my cabin. It was at the very center of my work area, tied to the fluorescent cap of marker GS-48. It was a note, written in a shaky, surprisingly elegant cursive on a piece of weathered brown paper bag. It said, "You map the dirt. You don't see the ground." Below the words was a drawing, a simple map. It wasn't a surveyor's map of grids and elevations. It was a map of landmarks, a split oak tree, a cluster of mossy boulders, a dry creek bed, and a series of small, drawn birds, like the carving, leading a path away from the survey line and deeper into the forest. My first instinct was to ignore it, to finish my work, get in my truck, and never come back. This was a clear invitation, a deliberate attempt to lure me off my designated path. Every rational thought screamed at me to refuse, but a deeper, more compelling curiosity had taken hold. The mystery was no longer something happening to me. It was a puzzle presented to me, and the only way to solve it, the only way to ever truly stop looking over my shoulder, was to follow. I packed my survey gear back into the truck. I took my phone, a compass, and a powerful flashlight. I looked at the hand-drawn map one more time, memorizing the crude symbols. The split oak was easy to spot, about 50 yards from the marker. From there, I followed the imagined line to the west, toward the cluster of boulders. The forest floor was a thick carpet of pine needles and damp earth, muffling my footsteps. As I walked, I began to see them. Small wooden birds, identical to the one left in my truck, hanging from low branches by twists of twine. They were markers of a different kind, a trail laid by a ghost. They guided me along the dry creek bed, up a gentle slope, and into a part of the woods that was older and denser than the area I'd been surveying. The trail of birds ended at a small, secluded clearing, sheltered by ancient, towering firs. In the center of the clearing was a single, low stone, no larger than a shoebox. It was dark gray and covered in a fine layer of green moss, but one side had been scraped clean. Carved into the stone, in the same rough but careful hand as the wooden birds, were a name and 2 dates. Alina, 1951 to 2018. Below the name was a carving of a single bird in flight. It wasn't a grave in a cemetery. It was just a stone in the woods, a marker, a memory. My survey grid, the precise lines and coordinates I had been so diligently mapping for a multi-million-dollar energy project, ran directly through this clearing. My stakes and flags were a cold, geometric intrusion on something deeply personal and sacred. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. An old man stood at the edge of the clearing. He was thin and weathered, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his beard the color of ash. He wore faded denim and a worn flannel shirt, and he held a small whittling knife in one hand and a half-finished wooden bird in the other. He wasn't menacing. He just looked tired. He was the man I'd seen in the Subaru. "Took you long enough," he said. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, connecting the dots. The moved stakes, laid parallel and pointing west, towards the spot. The stone placed in the hole a miniature headstone. The bird carvings, the locked truck, the cabin. He must have lived here his whole life, probably knew a dozen ways in and out of a place like that. "This is your wife?" I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the stone. "Alina, she loved the birds, especially the little wrens. Said they sing a prettier song than any person." He looked up at me, and his gaze was heavy with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight in the air. "I buried her here, on our land, or what used to be our land, before the timber company bought it out from under my father. But it's still her ground, her home." He looked at my work boots, at the GPS clipped to my belt. "You came with your sticks and your machines, pounding stakes into the ground. Her ground. I pulled them up. I tried to show you. I tried to tell you without words. You people with your maps, you don't see what's already there. The truck, the cabin. A man learns a few tricks, living out here his whole life," he said with a dismissive wave of his knife. "I wasn't going to hurt you. I just needed you to listen, to see. All the fear I had felt for days, the paranoia, the anger. It all just evaporated, replaced by a wave of shame. I was the intruder. I was the one desecrating a sacred place. My sterile corporate grid was an offense against a love that was rooted in this very soil. I didn't know," I said, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. "I'm sorry." He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "What will you do now, Simon the Surveyor?" I thought about my job, about Brenda, about the contract. None of it mattered. I thought about the cold dread of being watched, and how it was nothing compared to the quiet, unyielding grief of this man. When I was done, hours later, I stood by my truck and looked back into the woods. The old man was gone. On the hood of my truck sat one last wooden bird. I called Brenda that evening from the motel. I told her the terrain in the western sector was geologically unstable, prone to small, unpredictable landslides. I said it was an unsuitable foundation for the turbine towers. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie they would understand, a lie of data and liability. The project in that area was halted. I kept the first wooden bird, the one from my dashboard. I still have it. It sits on my desk, a small, crude reminder that the world is more than just lines on a map. It's a reminder that some places are owned not by title or by deed, but by memory and by love, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to stop, to see what's really there, and to quietly walk away.